The night was creeping in, slowly swallowing the road as the sun dipped below the horizon. I'd been on the road for what felt like hours, but the miles just kept stretching out ahead of me. As a long-haul trucker, I was used to long nights, the quiet hum of the engine, and the monotony of the highway. But tonight, something felt off. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty road ahead. I was on a stretch of Route 66, somewhere between the middle of nowhere and some other forgotten town that only existed on old maps. The air outside was cold, biting even, and I could feel it seeping in through the seams of the cab. I rolled down the window for a second, hoping to clear my head with a quick blast of fresh air, but the chill didn't help. If anything, it made me feel more uneasy. The radio, which I'd been tuning in and out of, suddenly crackled, the static turning into a garbled voice. At first I thought it was just interference, but then the voice began to make sense. Darkness. Road.never.come back. I turned the volume knob, but it didn't make any difference. The voice kept coming through, distorted and faint. It sounded like a warning, but who could I ask? There wasn't a soul on this stretch of highway for miles. I shook it off, telling myself it was just a glitch. I've been on the road long enough to know that truckers, especially in the middle of nowhere, often come across strange things. Radio waves mess with your mind sometimes, but then I noticed something in the distance, a flicker of light. At first, I thought it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me, but no, it was a headlight, coming from another vehicle. I slowed the truck down, feeling a strange discomfort creep into my chest. There was no one else on this road, not for miles. Yet there it was, a set of headlights in the distance, traveling in my direction. I checked my rearview mirror. Nothing, just empty highway. I glanced back ahead. The lights were getting closer, too close. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I don't know why, but something about the whole situation felt wrong. I kept driving, the truck's engine humming steadily beneath me. The mysterious headlights weren't far behind now. I was starting to get nervous, but I didn't want to overreact. Truckers are supposed to be tough, right? We don't panic easily. But then, out of nowhere, the truck's cabin lights flickered. For a split second, I thought I saw someone sitting in the passenger seat. I whipped my head around, but there was no one there. Just the empty seat, just me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I was overtired, that's all. But when I turned back to the road, the headlights were gone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. Maybe I had imagined it. I pressed on the accelerator, eager to put the weird experience behind me. But the road ahead was still as empty as before. I was alone. Or so I thought. The radio buzzed again, only this time it wasn't just a glitch. The voice was clear, sharp, and unmistakable. He's here. I froze, my heart racing in my chest. The voice was unmistakable, and it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. It was as if something, was whispering directly into my mind. I glanced around again. Still, no other vehicles in sight. Just the endless stretch of dark highway and the cold, silent night. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't a person, though. It was something bigger, taller, like a figure standing just on the edge of the road, hidden in the darkness. But every time I turned my head, it vanished. I shook my head, trying to focus. Maybe I was just losing it. The fatigue was getting to me, I thought. I'd been on the road for days now, chasing a delivery that didn't seem to have an end. Maybe it was time to pull over for a break. I kept driving, trying to ignore the growing unease in my gut. But then, without warning, the engine sputtered. I glanced at the dashboard, and the fuel gauge was on empty. That couldn't be right. I had filled up just a few hours. I pulled the truck over to the side of the road, my fingers trembling as I shifted the gear into park. The headlights illuminated the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I grabbed the flashlight from the passenger seat and stepped out of the truck. The cold air hit me like a slap in the face, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. As I walked around to the back of the rig, I noticed something strange. There was a set of footprints in the dirt, fresh ones leading off into the trees beside the highway. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I wasn't alone. The footprints were too big to be from a normal person, and they led deeper into the woods, as if something had been following me. A sudden crack of twigs behind me made me spin around. My flashlight darted across the empty road, but there was no one there. Just calm down, I told myself. Just get back in the truck and keep going. But I couldn't. I was frozen, standing there in the middle of nowhere, with the eerie feeling of being watched wrapping around me like a vice. I took one last look around, and that's when I saw it again. The shadow. It was bigger now, closer, moving slowly toward me from the woods. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, and it was coming right for me. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The flashlight in my hand trembled, casting erratic beams of light across the darkened road. The figure in the distance, it didn't look human. No, it wasn't human. The way it moved, almost gliding, was unnatural, like something out of a nightmare. I took a step backward, my boots crunching on the gravel as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It was tall, far too tall to be anyone I knew. Its shape was long and thin, and even in the dim light, I could make out some details. Its limbs were twisted, bent in a way that made my stomach churn. No human could move like that. I backed up a little more, turning my head toward the truck. Maybe I could make a run for it, start the engine and drive off before whatever this was got any closer. But as I turned my head, the truck wasn't where I had left it. The rig, the big heavy truck that I had just stepped out of, was gone. I froze, my feet rooted to the ground. My mind screamed in disbelief, and I whipped my head around in every direction, trying to find the truck. But there was nothing, just empty road, trees, and shadows. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl. The sound came from behind me. The shadow was closer now, moving faster. My flashlight flickered, almost as if it were warning me, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I started to run, but the moment my feet hit the ground, I heard something else, a soft, eerie chuckle, like a voice not quite human. I didn't stop running. My breath burned in my throat, my legs aching, but I kept going, not daring to look back. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches swaying as though in some kind of twisted dance. And then I saw it, a light, far in the distance, blinking like a beacon in the dark. It was a gas station. I pushed myself harder, praying it wasn't a hallucination. The light grew brighter, and the shadows of the trees began to recede, replaced by the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. I could see the station now, old and run down, but it was something. I couldn't care less about its state. It was a safe haven. As I approached, I could hear the soft hum of a generator running. The flickering lights above the pumps cast strange shadows, making everything seem more eerie than it should have been. I reached the door and tried to open it, but it was locked. My hands shook as I knocked, banging desperately on the door. "Help!" I shouted, my voice breaking. "Please, anyone!" The door creaked open, and I stumbled inside, gasping for air. A man in his late 50s, with graying hair and a worn-out face, was standing behind the counter, staring at me with cold eyes. "You're running from something, ain't you?" he asked, his voice gravelly. It was as if he already knew. I nodded, not knowing how to explain what had happened, but knowing in my gut that I wasn't just imagining things. "That's a bad stretch of road you're on," the man said, his gaze flicking toward the door. "You shouldn't have been out there, not at this hour." I took a shaky step back. "What are you talking about? What's out there?" The man didn't respond at first. Instead, he wiped his hands on a rag and looked back at me. "Nothing good. You're not the first to end up here like this." I felt the weight of his words sink in, but I couldn't make sense of it. "What do you mean?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This road, it doesn't let people go, and the thing you saw, it's not just a ghost, it's something else, something older." I shook my head. No, this doesn't make sense." But before he could respond, a loud banging sound echoed from outside, followed by a deep growl. The floor beneath my feet seemed to tremble. The man behind the counter didn't flinch. Instead, he simply walked over to the window, peering out. "It's here," he muttered under his breath. I followed him, my pulse racing, and I could feel a chill crawl down my spine as I looked out into the dark. There, just beyond the glow of the station lights, I saw it. The figure, that twisted shadow. It was standing in the middle of the road now, unmoving, staring at the station. "Why doesn't it come in?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The man didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, his face grim. "Because it knows it can't. Not yet." "What do you mean?" He turned away from the window, his eyes hard as steel. "It can't enter a place where the light is, where there's someone who knows the truth. But that's not going to stop it. It's patient. It's been out there longer than you or I can remember." I couldn't breathe. "What is it?" "That thing," he said, his voice low, "is a creature that feeds on the lost. It's a thing that crawls in the shadows, waiting for travelers like you to pass. And once it's found you, it won't let go. It'll follow you. It'll haunt you, until you're just another set of bones in the woods." I backed away, the cold sweat on my skin making me feel like I was suffocating. "I don't understand. How do I get away?" The man shook his head. "You don't. Not once it's chosen you. But you can try. Keep the light on. Keep moving. Don't stop until you hit the next town." I felt a lump form in my throat, and all I could do was stare at him, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. "But I can't go back out there. It'll kill me." "That's what it wants you to think," he said, his voice growing softer. "It wants to trap you in fear. It wants to make you believe it's impossible to escape. But you can. You just have to keep moving, and don't let it catch you." I turned toward the door, my body shaking, my mind spinning. But before I could make another step, the lights outside flickered. The growl from the figure grew louder. It was getting closer. I had to go. I didn't hesitate any longer. I grabbed the door handle, yanked it open, and stepped back outside into the chilling night. The air felt thicker now, heavy with dread. The growls from the figure in the distance were sharper, more distinct. It was closer than before, and I could feel its presence like a suffocating weight on my chest. The gas station lights flickered again, casting long, grotesque shadows across the dirt parking lot. My heart was thumping so loud it was a wonder the man couldn't hear it too. "Go!" the man shouted from behind me, his voice harsh and urgent. "Get moving. Don't stop for anything." I nodded, swallowing hard, trying to steady my breath as I sprinted back down the gravel road toward the truck. But the moment my foot hit the ground, a sharp, horrible screech echoed through the trees, rattling my bones. I didn't turn to look. The engine roared to life. I was still parked exactly where I had left it, the engine idling like it had been waiting for me. Maybe it was the adrenaline, but I didn't question it. I scrambled into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and threw the truck into gear. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my eyes scanning the road ahead, every nerve screaming for me to get the hell out of there. The headlights cut through the darkness once more, illuminating the empty stretch of highway, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and my stomach churned with every mile I put between myself and the gas station. The growls from behind me echoed through the trees, but I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. I couldn't. I knew what I would see. It, that thing, following me, keeping pace with the truck despite my desperate speed. I floored the accelerator, but the road seemed endless, stretching out in front of me, the darkness swallowing everything. The miles rolled on, but the air in the cab felt colder, and the shadows outside grew deeper, more oppressive. That's when it happened. The truck jolted violently. It felt like something had slammed into the side, forcing the rig to swerve. I gripped the wheel, fighting for control. My heart hammered in my chest as I struggled to keep the truck on the road. I didn't dare look out the window, but I could hear the scraping sound, like claws against metal. I slammed my foot on the brake, pulling the truck to a screeching halt. My hands were slick with sweat, the dashboard lights flashing erratically. I sat there for a second, my breath coming fast and shallow, listening. Nothing. I couldn't hear anything. The growls had stopped. The scraping sound had faded into the distance. But I couldn't afford to rest. I couldn't stay here. I hit the gas again, and this time I didn't let up. The road stretched out before me, a never-ending tunnel of darkness. I didn't know how far I'd gone or how long I'd been driving, but my eyes were heavy. My mind was foggy. I'd been awake for too long, and the exhaustion was threatening to overtake me. That's when I saw it. A figure on the side of the road, standing just outside the beam of my headlights. I slammed on the brakes. It was him, the man from the gas station, the one who had warned me. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. But it wasn't just fear in his eyes. It was something else, something that made my blood run cold. He was pointing at me, at my truck, shouting something. But the wind howled, and the sound was drowned out by the deafening rush of blood in my ear. I leaned out the window trying to hear him, but before I could react, I saw the shadow behind him. That same figure, the one I had seen earlier, the twisted, unnatural shape. It was standing behind the man, towering over him like a predator about to claim its prey. The man's mouth moved. His words were frantic, desperate, but his face twisted into something unnatural, something that made my stomach churn. The creature's mouth opened, wide, impossibly wide, and I heard a sound that made me want to crawl out of my skin. A sound like bones snapping and cracking, a horrible, wet slurping noise. The man's scream was cut off mid-air. I couldn't breathe. I slammed the truck into gear and gunned it. The engine roared, and I could feel the vibrations shaking the whole rig. But I didn't dare look back. I couldn't face what I had just seen. I just kept driving. The world outside was a blur, the road stretching endlessly ahead of me, the shadows flickering in the corners of my vision. I couldn't think straight. My heart raced. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. And then I saw something else. In the distance, just ahead, a sign. It was a small, weathered road sign with faded letters, but I could make out what it said. Welcome to Oakhaven. I didn't know if it was a town or some kind of cruel joke, but I didn't care. I was going there. Away from it. As I neared the sign, something caught my eye. A figure standing at the entrance to the town. Just like before. I felt the truck slow down, as if something were trying to stop it. The figure stepped forward, its form half hidden in shadow, but I didn't stop this time. I kept my foot pressed hard on the accelerator, my eyes locked straight ahead. And that's when I heard it. The voice, that voice, the same distorted voice from the radio, now clear and unmistakable. You can't run. You're already ours. The lights flickered. The engine sputtered, and everything went dark. The truck came to a sudden, violent stop. The engine sputtered, then died, leaving nothing but the silence of the night pressing in from all sides. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly I could feel the blood draining from my fingers. I tried to turn the key again, but the truck didn't respond. It was as though the engine had decided to give up on me. I sat there for a moment, my breath coming in jagged gasps. The darkness outside seemed to grow thicker, suffocating me. That voice, it was still in my head. You can't run. You're already ours. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was so close. I didn't know where it was coming from, but I felt its presence, like a cold breath on my neck, like something was standing just behind me, waiting for me to make a move. I turned the key again. Nothing. Panic began to swell in my chest. My heart hammered, my mind racing through 1,000 scenarios. I knew I couldn't stay in the truck, but I also knew that whatever was out there, whatever was chasing me, was coming closer by the second. I opened the door slowly, and the cold air hit me like a slap in the face. My breath fogged up in front of me as I stepped out, my boots crunching on the gravel. I could hear the whisper of the wind through the trees, but it was drowned out by something else, something low, a growl, soft and menacing. I turned to face the town, Oakhaven. The lights of the town were dim, almost like they were flickering out. There was no sound of life, no cars, no voices, no movement at all. I wasn't sure if it was better to head toward the lights or away from them, but I couldn't stay here. Whatever was out there was closing in on me, and I could feel it. The creature had found me. As I took a step forward, a shadow darted across the street, moving with unnatural speed. I froze, my blood running cold. I wasn't alone. It was there, just at the edge of the light. I couldn't make out its shape clearly, but I knew enough. It wasn't human. It was tall, far too tall, and its limbs twisted in ways that made my stomach churn. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, as though it was studying me, and for a split second, I thought I saw its eyes glowing, two pits of dark, empty voids that seemed to reflect the light back at me like mirrors. I turned and ran. The sound of my footsteps echoed on the pavement, the rush of blood in my ears drowning out all other noises. My legs burned, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when I knew that thing was behind me, hunting. I ran down the main street, trying to make it past the eerie silence of the town. The buildings were old, crumbling, as if they hadn't seen a single soul in years. There was something unsettling about the way the shadows clung to the edges of the streets, as if they were alive, watching. A streetlight flickered overhead, and that's when I heard it. The scraping sound. It was slow at first, like nails dragging across a chalkboard, but it was getting louder, closer. Then, a shrill screech echoed through the empty streets, making me stumble in fear. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The thing was getting closer. It was toying with me, like a predator playing with its prey. I could almost hear its breath, low and guttural, just behind me. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. I kept running, but my legs were giving out. I couldn't keep up the pace. My lungs burned, and I could feel my vision starting to blur. Then ahead of me, I saw something that made my heart stop. A figure. It was standing just ahead, at the end of the street. Another person? Maybe someone who could help? But as I drew closer, I froze. It wasn't a person. It was the man from the gas station, the one who had warned me. But now, his face was twisted in an expression of pure agony. His skin was stretched tight, as if something had been pulling at it, and his eyes were empty, hollow, like they had been sucked out by something that wasn't natural. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The man raised one arm, pointing behind me, his mouth opening in a silent scream. I didn't wait to see what he was pointing at. I turned and ran the other way, stumbling in a blind panic. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my body screaming in protest. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it catch me. I reached the end of the street and spotted an old building, an abandoned church, its tall steeple rising up into the night sky. The windows were boarded up, but the door was cracked open just enough for me to slip through. I rushed in, heart pounding. It was dim, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. It felt like the building had been abandoned for decades. I didn't care. I just needed to hide. I stumbled down the aisle, the wooden pews creaking beneath my feet as I tried to find a place to hide. There were no other people, no sign of life, just the oppressive silence, like the town had been swallowed up by time itself. I ducked behind a pew, trying to catch my breath. My pulse thudded in my ears, and I was shaking uncontrollably. The growls from outside were getting closer again, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. I heard something. Footsteps. Heavy, slow, dragging footsteps. It was there. The thing was coming. I didn't dare peek out from behind the pew. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to know what it was capable of. But I could hear it getting closer, each step, each scrape of its claws against the floorboards, sending a wave of dread through me. And then, the door to the church creaked open. The figure stepped inside, its form barely visible in the dim light. It didn't move toward me immediately. No, it lingered there, almost as if it was savoring my fear. And that's when I heard the voice again. That same distorted, otherworldly voice, whispering in my ear, even though it wasn't physically close to me. You can't hide forever. You belong to the darkness now. You belong to us. I held my breath, hoping it wouldn't hear me, hoping it wouldn't find me. But the silence grew heavier, and the creature's presence pressed in on me like an invisible force. I wasn't safe. Not here. Not anywhere. The silence in the church was suffocating, and I couldn't move. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to do anything to escape, but I couldn't. I was frozen. I knew, deep down, that there was no escaping this thing. It was too late. The creature was in the church now, moving with a deliberate slowness, almost savoring the hunt. I could hear its breathing, low and heavy, as though it had all the time in the world. Its claws scraped the floor, sending chills down my spine, and I felt the weight of its presence pressing in from every direction. I turned my head slightly, peeking through a crack in the pew in front of me. The creature was there, standing just beyond the aisle, its long limbs twisted at impossible angles. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its gaze, cold, calculating, empty, locking onto me. My heart hammered in my chest, but my legs wouldn't obey. I couldn't run. I couldn't scream. I couldn't do anything. And then the creature spoke. "Don't run," it said, its voice like nails scraping across metal. It was a voice that carried the weight of centuries, an ancient unearthly presence that filled the air with dread. "You've already been marked." I tried to breathe, but the air felt thick in my lungs. I could feel my body trembling uncontrollably, like I was being pulled into some dark, inescapable gravity. "Why me?" I gasped, barely able to speak. "Why are you doing this?" The creature tilted its head, its eyes, those black empty pits, burning with a cold, merciless intent. "Because you're here. Because you came." I shuddered, the realization sinking in. The roads, the long hauls, the loneliness, it had all led me here, to this place. I was just another lost soul, another victim in its eternal hunt. With a deep, rasping sigh, the creature took a step forward, its limbs contorting grotesquely. There is no escaping. There never was. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the horror of its approach, but it didn't help. The air around me grew colder, the shadows deeper. I felt its presence, pressing in on me, felt it moving closer, closer, and then everything went black. I woke up with a gasp, my body jerking upright. I was back in the truck. The engine roared to life, the familiar hum of the wheels beneath me as I drove down the highway, the road stretching endlessly before me. My heart was still racing, my palms sweating, but everything felt normal. The truck, the lights, the road. Had it all been a dream? I looked around, trying to catch my breath. The town of Oakhaven was nowhere in sight. The road was quiet. There were no strange figures lurking in the shadows. No growls, no screeches. It had to be a dream, right? But as I turned the corner, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. I froze. The figure, it was there. It was standing in the distance, far behind me, just at the edge of the trees. I couldn't make out its form clearly, but I knew it. It was waiting for me. My pulse quickened, and I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding faster and faster, trying to escape the darkness that had followed me. But I knew it was only a matter of time before it would catch up to me. The thing, the creature, I was marked. There was no running. There was no escape. The road ahead stretched on forever, and I kept driving. The engine roared louder, drowning out everything. The headlights cut through the endless night, but I knew, deep in my bones, that no matter how fast I went, I could never outrun it. I had already lost. It was another late night on the road. The sun had long disappeared, and the world outside the cab was a sea of black, with only the occasional flicker of distant headlights and the glow from my dashboard illuminating the interior of my truck. I had been driving for hours, more than I should have, but I was just a couple 100 miles away from my destination. The big rigs tend to get the best of you when the road is all you've got for company, and after being on the job for as long as I had, I could handle it. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic sound of the tires on the asphalt always helped keep me focused. But tonight, there was something off about the air. The usual highway noises seemed muffled, and even though I was driving at a steady 65 miles per hour, the truck felt slower than usual. Maybe it was the fatigue, or maybe it was just the isolation. The loneliness of the road was something that would sometimes start playing tricks on my mind. I was on a stretch of Interstate 84, cutting through the edge of a forested area. The signs had warned me about the wildlife, but I'd seen enough deer and raccoons to know how to handle it. Still, there was something different in the way the trees seemed to lean in closer tonight, like they were pressing against the road. They almost looked like dark, twisted fingers reaching out, trying to grab at the truck. I let out a sigh and turned on the radio, hoping to drown out the creeping feeling of unease. But the static on the station was thick, and it wasn't long before the station cut out entirely. I fiddled with the dial, but nothing came through, just that uncomfortable silence that echoed through the cab. Then, out of nowhere, my headlights caught something. At first, I thought it was just a reflection in the fogged-up windshield, but as I squinted, I realized it was a figure. A man standing by the side of the road, barely visible in the dark. He was dressed in tattered clothes, his face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. I slowed the truck down instinctively, but something about the way he stood there made me hesitate. Something didn't sit right. The stretch of highway was long and lonely, and there was no reason for anyone to be out there at this hour, especially in such a remote area. As I approached him, I saw his hand raise slowly, as if he were signaling me to stop, but there was a strange, unnatural stillness to his movements. I kept my foot on the pedal. There was no way I was picking up a hitchhiker this late in the night, not on a stretch of road like this. I could feel my heart beat faster, a cold sweat forming at the back of my neck. But as I passed by, my rearview mirror caught a glimpse of him again. That's when I saw it, the shadow of something moving behind him, a shape, tall and dark, almost blending into the trees. I couldn't make out what it was, but the feeling it gave me was unmistakable. This wasn't just a man. Something else was out there, and I had no intention of finding out what. I floored the accelerator, pushing the truck forward, the engine roaring in protest. My mind raced, but I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, just another bump in the road. The thought of pulling over at the next rest stop seemed like the best idea. But I had learned the hard way that things weren't always what they seemed on the road. Sometimes it was better to keep going. A few miles later, I passed a rundown diner on the side of the road. The flickering neon sign read, "Open 24 hours," but the place looked as though it had been abandoned for years. The windows were cracked, and the door hung slightly ajar. Still, the interior lights glowed dimly through the dusty windows. My eyes lingered on the diner for a moment longer than I intended, and before I knew it, I had pulled off the highway and into the gravel parking lot. I was barely conscious of making the decision. It was like my hands had a mind of their own. The truck's tires crunched over the gravel as I parked under a broken street lamp. I stepped out of the cab, my boots sinking into the dirt. The cold air bit at my skin, but it was the eerie silence that really sent chills down my spine. No other trucks were parked around, no sign of life, just the sound of wind rustling through the trees. I hesitated for a moment, but the flickering lights of the diner seemed to call out to me. Some felt like a refuge, like a place where I could shake off the tension and reset my mind. As I approached the diner, the door creaked open on its own, as if welcoming me inside. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever lay ahead. Something in the air felt off, but the exhaustion of the road kept pushing me forward. The dimly lit interior was mostly empty, save for a few dusty tables and a long counter where a single lamp cast a soft glow. The place smelled stale, the kind of musty odor you'd expect from a place left untouched for years. Behind the counter stood an older woman, her wrinkled face partially obscured by the dim lighting. She didn't seem surprised to see me, though it felt like she had been waiting for me. Her eyes, dark and hollow, were locked on mine as I approached. "Hungry?" she asked, her voice raspy, as if she hadn't spoken in days. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was hungry or just needed the company. I took a seat at the counter, my fingers tapping lightly on the wood. The silence in the diner was unnerving. No sounds of cooking or chatter, just the hum of an old refrigerator in the back. As she slid a menu across the counter, I noticed her hands were trembling slightly, as if they had their own story to tell. She had the look of someone who had lived through things that would have broken most people. I scanned the menu, though my mind wasn't on food. Something about this place seemed wrong, and the shadows in the corners of the room only added to the unease. "What's the special?" I asked, my voice sounding louder than I intended. She leaned in close, her face nearly touching mine. Her breath smelled of something old, something like decay. "There's no special," she whispered, her eyes glinting with a strange intensity. "But you're not really here for food, are you?" A shiver ran down my spine, and I froze. Her words lingered in the air, thick with meaning. I opened my mouth to ask what she meant, but before I could, I heard it. An unmistakable noise, soft at first, then growing louder. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps, coming from somewhere deep in the diner. My pulse quickened. I turned toward the sound, but there was no one there. Just the same dusty booths, the same empty tables. Then the footsteps stopped. And then someone emerged from the darkness. A tall figure, cloaked in shadow. The same man I had seen on the road earlier, but now his face was visible. It was pale, stretched, and too still to be real. His eyes were wide and unblinking, and there was no sign of warmth in them, no humanity. He walked slowly toward me, his every step deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. I stood up, but my legs felt like lead. I wanted to run, but my feet refused to move. I felt trapped, cornered, like there was no escape from this nightmare. The woman behind the counter didn't speak. She just watched as the man came closer, her eyes darkening, like she knew this moment was inevitable. "You've been driving too long," the man's voice rasped, though his lips didn't move. It was like the words were coming from everywhere at once. "The road has claimed you. You're already part of it now." I opened my mouth to scream, but the sound died in my throat. The walls of the diner seemed to close in, the shadows twisting and warping around me. The man's face cracked into a grin, but it wasn't a friendly one. It was wide, impossibly wide, stretching from ear to ear. The darkness around us thickened, and I could feel the cold air crawling under my skin, tightening around my chest. "You shouldn't have stopped," he whispered. In an instant, everything went black. I woke up in the cab of my truck, the engine still running, the headlights illuminating the empty road ahead. The smell of the diner lingered in the air, but everything felt wrong. I was still in the same spot, miles from any rest area. The road stretched out in front of me, and there was no sign of the diner, no sign of the man. But as I looked into the rearview mirror, I saw something. A shadow, his face, smiling at me from the dark, and then I realized the truth. I wasn't leaving. The road had claimed me,